If you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. And we are closing in on the end of this thing. We're making it through. I believe we're going to be getting to the end of Ephesians on the first Sunday in December. If you schedule ahead and need to know that in your mind. But I hope you have enjoyed the study as much as I have. I love going through this book. And have, like with any book, seen a lot of things that maybe I've not noticed before as we work our way through. Ephesians chapter 5, we will begin in verse 1, where Paul says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children." And so we begin this chapter with a therefore, which tells us a couple things, that there's probably going to be some context that comes before this and maybe some that comes after that explains what he's talking about. And so if you think back, he's talked a lot about being dead to the ways that are old and not walking in those ways anymore and now living in this new kind of way. Or if you just want to think of the immediate context, the previous verse says this, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you." And so we see a little bit here about what it is to be an imitator of God. We are to be people who are being kind, who are being forgiving, and who are caring about one another the way God cares about us. And then he says as he begins verse 2, "and walk in love." Now, if you have not been here during this series, I'll just catch you up. We've talked a lot about how this word walk keeps coming up in the book of Ephesians. And as it comes up, it reminds us of this is a way to live. Biblically, when we see walk, we're reminded that this is something that is a daily life kind of thing. And so to catch us up, we have seen walk in several places. We did this last week. We'll do it again this week because it came up again. In Ephesians 2, we see that we're to walk in good works. In Ephesians 2 and verse 10. And then in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 1, we see that we are to walk in this manner that is worthy to which we have been called. And so we're walking in a worthy manner. So we're walking in a way where we're doing good things, and we're walking in a way so that we carry the name that we have well. I think I mentioned to you guys before, somewhere along the way, we had a family in Searcy whose name was the Huckabees. And they had these boys, and they would tell their boys that this is what Huckabee boys do and don't do. And we kind of picked up on that with our own kids, and we would say things like, Lewis boys don't do that, or Lewis boys need to do that. When we are Christians representing God, people of God walk in this way that is worthy. And then later in chapter 4, he says that we must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. And we talked about a couple weeks ago how this is to walk with purpose. We're to be people who are purposeful in the way we walk. We're not just walking around aimlessly or in the futility of their minds, as Paul describes there. We're walking as people with purpose behind what we do. And then, as we just read a moment ago here in chapter 5 and verse 2, we are to walk in love. And he goes further in that verse by saying, to walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So this love we're walking in is a love that is sacrificial. And he talks a lot about this idea of how God loves us and about God loves us in a way to be sacrificial. And the example being Christ, that God loves us so much that he sends Jesus for us. Now, when Paul talks in sacrificial terms, clearly to him, that's going to mean the same kind of sacrifice. He's going to give his life for all this in the fact that he's going to lose his life on behalf of this. Now, for most of us, we don't live in a place where that's a danger. Now, it may not always be that way, we don't know, but for us now, to be a Christian, although it may be unpopular at times, although people may look at you and think there's something wrong with you for living that way at times, usually your life is not threatened as a result of that. But we can still be sacrificial in the way that we love. Paul put it this way in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." So this sacrificial love that we have is one that says, I'm willing to give up what I might otherwise do in life sacrificially to love God, to love others. If you were not in class this morning in the auditorium, Jet talked about gentleness. And in the midst of that, we talked about being kind in several things and being nice. And I mentioned to Jet at the end there in the back, there are a lot of times that I've caught myself having the thought, okay, I've tried being nice. Maybe you've been there somewhere along the way where you have tried to be nice to someone, you're not getting the result you're looking for, they're not being nice to you, they're being mean to you, and you think to yourself, Okay, I'm done being nice now. I'm going to take the gloves off. We have so many different ways of saying the same thing because we've all been there. We've tried being nice, and I think Paul would say to us, well, being nice is not something you try. Being nice is something that you are. Being loving is a sacrificial way of living. This is who you are now. And so when there comes a time where you feel like, okay, this should be enough, you just keep on loving. We talked in class a little bit this morning about the idea that sometimes you are taken advantage of because of that. And if anyone understood that, it's Jesus. How many times is Jesus taken advantage of? How many times is Jesus mistreated and he loves in return? When we think of the times that Jesus acts in what looks, at least on the surface, to not be love, and I think as we get under it to the core, it is, but we think of things like his anger with the money changers in the temple. We think of all those woes to the Pharisees and hypocrites, but yet we have these 3 years of Jesus' life that are just detailed, and how few are the examples where you don't immediately think nice and kind and good and loving. This Jesus who knows what people are about still always responds in love and kindness and goodness. So we are to be a living sacrifice. But continuing in verse 3, but sexual immorality and all impurity and covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. Now, this phrase, must not be named among you, I think is probably something that will be kind of a colloquialism of their day. Now, to us, we don't talk this way. I kind of like, Jason's already been picked on once today. I hate to do it again. I kind of like the Jason's Bible version, the NIV Bible version of this, which is this. But among you, there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or these other things. So there must not be a hint of these things. That's what he's saying when he says this must not even be named among you. So when people say of you, there is this going on, if it's something that's evil or of these things, people should immediately think, well, there's no way. That's not something that could happen. I used to ask people in my youth group, if I were to come to you and say, so-and-so is involved in a scandal, whose name would I say that you would not believe me even though I'm your youth minister? If I were to get up here today and say, there's a scandal involving somebody, which by the way, I would never do that, but if I was to get up and say that, what name could I attach to it and you would think, there is no way in the world that would ever happen? I would imagine we all probably have a name or a face in our mind. For a lot of us, probably someone in this room that we would think, there's no way. That is what it looks like for there not to even be a hint of this. You would be so completely shocked to hear it, it just wouldn't even make sense. And so verses 3 and 4 here, although they're separated into 2 verses and 2 sentences in our English Bibles, it is all one thought in one sentence within the Greek. So I want us to look at it together. The print will be a little smaller than usual. But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. Let there be no filthiness or foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are all out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. I will date myself a little bit here, and some of you who are older maybe watch this with your kids. Some of you who are younger who have no idea. But somewhere along the way, I believe it was on Sesame Street, it was either that or the Electric Company, there was the song of, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. And so they would have this group of things, and they're trying to teach kids how to categorize stuff. And there would be all these things that were kind of part of the same, and then one that stood out. For us as Christians within the church, when we read this list of stuff, if anything like this were to happen, it does not fit. There shouldn't be a hint of it. This should not be named among us. It is out of place. And Paul could list a whole lot of other things here, but for whatever reason, he picks on these here for the church at Ephesus. And so notice what he does. First of all, he lists off actions. You have sexual immorality, you have impurity, and as the NIV puts it, I believe you have greed. So these actions, these things that we do, maybe they're thoughts that lead to action if you want to think in those terms, but all of these things should not be the kind of activity that we're involved in. And if you're like most people, you will probably begin to look at the list and you'll see something that you don't have a struggle with or you've not been guilty of, and you'll start to feel good about it. But then by the time you get to greed, most of us have probably struggled with that somewhere along the way. From the time you were a toddler and first said mine, you have struggled along the way with the idea of greed. And most of us, by the way, will put that in terms of something that is someone else's problem. We think of wealthy as someone who is wealthier than us. Greedy, those are the people on Wall Street, isn't that? That's how we hear it on the news. It's the greed of Wall Street or the greed of wherever. Most of us have some struggle along with sexual immorality or impurity or greed, or maybe some combination of the three. And I think part of why Paul lists greed here, by the way, is because the other two kind of relate to that, don't they? It's that greed, that selfishness that leads us toward the other two. And then he talks about words. And we would think, I mean, again, we're toddlers and we say mine. We're also toddlers when someone told us, well-meaning, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, I don't know about you, but most of the hurts I can think of in life have nothing to do with sticks or stones. They're words. And so he says, not just these actions, but also these words you have to worry about. And so he says, no filthiness, no foolish talk, no cruel joking. Can we now have sitcoms on TV anymore? Because it's all kind of this, isn't it? And I've been as guilty as any of watching those shows and laughing at those jokes. I will tell you, as your preacher, one of the most uncomfortable things for me as a preacher is the fact that almost any situation I am put in, there is a one-liner that comes to my mind like that. It would get a laugh. I know it would. I wrestle just a little bit with, should I say this or should I not say this? And sometimes it falls into these things. How often are our minds there? And I think to myself again of Jesus, that Jesus who is kind and nice and gentle with people who will mistreat him. Do you think Jesus' mind is on these things? Or is his mind on something else? And for us, although we get laughs and entertainment out of these kinds of things, would our lives be better if our minds were not here, but were instead in places of God? And I will tell you, this is a challenge. This is one of those that I am not good at all the time. I'd like to be better at. But this is something that Paul is calling us through the words of the Spirit to do, to get our minds and our actions off of these things. Moving on to verse 5. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or who is covetous, that is, an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Now Paul has kind of spelled it out for us, hadn't he? If you have felt good about, well, I'm not doing those things, everything's fine, then he says, you know what, all those things really are, they're idolatry. Now, none of us would go out in our backyards, I don't think, any of us would go out in our backyards today, find a stick or a log or a tree out there that looked just, and think, well, this looks just right, and then we would cut that thing down and carve out something, and there before us is this idol. And then we would begin to worship that thing. We would think anyone who did that, they have not evolved as people. There's something weird going on there. Why would anyone think that way? And yet, how many things do we do idolatry with? Because all it is placing a thing in the place of God. So all of the sexual sins and impurity and greed that he talks about, that's putting those things above God, in the place of God. Or when we think on things that are not things of God, because in other places we do read to think on things that are good and pure and right and noble. What are we doing when we think on other things? Idolatry. We're putting something else in the place of God. And when we do that, we have no inheritance in the kingdom. And that should probably scare the life out of us just a little bit. Because we want this inheritance within the kingdom. And so Paul says, all right, we talk about what's a salvation issue. We talk about what is a heaven and hell thing. We talk about what do I do to be saved. Paul talks about the flip side here. If you're doing these things, there's no inheritance. And so now the piece of me that has the one-liner ready to go, the piece of me that laughs at the joke, thinks, this is serious. This really matters. Verse 6, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Now, I like reading in the wrath of God section in Romans 1, all of the awful things that those people are doing, because I think to myself, I'm not doing those things. And I don't want the wrath of God. Now, I hate the idea of anybody getting the wrath of God, but if there is a list of wrath of God stuff, I don't want the stuff I do on there. But now Paul takes it outside of all those major big sins and comes to this. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God has come on the sons of disobedience. Now, we do not want to be the sons of disobedience, so Paul is going to show us the other option. We basically have a either-or kind of choice, the kind of choice our world does not like. Our world likes lots of different options and a little piece of this and a little piece of that. And Paul says instead, you can be sons of disobedience. Sons of disobedience with no inheritance, or you can be something different. Therefore, do not become partners with them. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. So now we're walking in another way. We're walking in love at the beginning of the chapter, and now we're walking as children of light. So when we think of being imitators of God, back in verse 1, how many times have you seen a child imitating a parent? Walking in the steps, doing things the way that they do it, looking at them and then looking what they do and trying to do the same thing. My son and I, David and I, went golfing on Thursday. David texted me Wednesday. He said, hey, you want to go golfing tomorrow? And I thought, no, I don't. The last time I went, it wasn't very good. I'm kind of busy on Thursday. It's probably the busiest day of the week. And I got all this stuff. But then I thought, all right, David is living on his own in Dallas now, experiencing life as an adult. It is rare for him to call me and say, hey, do you want to go do something that involves spending a day together? And so I thought, okay, I'll go. Now, the reason I didn't golf much with David when he was small was this. It was, I didn't want him to imitate the way I did it. Because when he was small, I thought if he watches how I swing and does this, I will ruin his life. And he will never be good at this. He will hate golf as much as I do. And he will go out there and it'll be awful. And I thought, I'm going to, and I think David kind of misread that as I didn't want to hang out with him or play golf with him. It wasn't that. I was afraid he would do it the way I did it. Now for us, as we are called to be imitators of God, Paul has spelled out a lot of it, which begins with, you can't be like this. You can't be like the world around you with that value system. You have to do it in a different way. And if you do choose to do it that way, it doesn't end well. There's no inheritance. So instead, be children of light. Be people who walk the way that Jesus walks. Be people that do things the way that God does them. And he says, as he continues in verse 9, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Now, our kids would do this from time to time. And I think a lot of us probably do this for people we care about as time to time. You find something that is pleasing to the people you care about, and you try to do those things. And so Paul says, do what's pleasing to the Lord. And what's pleasing, what he describes here is what is good and what is right or what is just, same word in the New Testament, and then what is true. God likes these things. So if you're walking like him, being an imitator of him, then you're going to do things that are good and things that are right or just and things that are true. This is who we are to be. This is what we are to be about. Then he says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. So these unfruitful works, the works of darkness that he describes, you don't want to be any part of that. Because what do we know about those unfruitful things? They will begin to contaminate what is around them, and it will take root, and it will grow in us something that we don't want growing there. And so he says, have nothing to do with that. In the Expositor's Bible Commentary, it says this. Here he clarifies a potential misunderstanding. His point is not that believers avoid any contact with those who sin, but they avoid participating in the sinful deeds sinners do. So we see that in Jesus, don't we? Jesus is around. He's accused of it all the time, tax collectors and sinners. It's not saying that we can't be around people who are sinful. It's saying that when we're there, we have to be sure that the light is moving in the right direction and the darkness is not overtaking it. So we are people that by our nature have to be a light to those who are stuck in sin without ourselves becoming stuck in sin. And there's the challenge, isn't it? We tend to go to extremes with this. It's either, well, I don't want to be around anybody who's like that. And the trouble is, well, if anybody who's like that is never around any Christians, they're never going to change. There's never going to be a reason to be different. But then at the same time, how many Christians have we known who have gotten a little too close and a little too free and then find themselves right where everybody else is? And so how do we balance out all of those things? So he says in Ephesians 5 and verse 13, but when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. It all comes back to the light, doesn't it? I don't know if Kyle did this on purpose or if the Spirit is moving. The first few songs we had this morning all had light in the midst of them. We were singing about light. When light comes into what we're doing, everything is exposed. And then Christ will shine on us. So think for a minute about what Jesus says about light. In John chapter 8, he says this, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have light of light. So Jesus is the light of the world, and when we are walking with him, when we're walking as children of light, we will not be walking in darkness. We will be able to see and to see clearly. If you have ever been stuck in the dark without light, and know the disorientation that happens there, or sometimes the fear that comes with it. So Jesus comes to us and offers light. And then he says, in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14, you are the light of the world. A city on the hill cannot be hidden. So he first says, I am the light of the world, or I guess reverse the order if we see where it's at in the gospel. He says, I am the light of the world, but he also in the Sermon on the Mount says, you are the light of the world. But we are the light of the world in a little bit different kind of way, aren't we? I don't know if you saw I think they call it the blood moon or something that happened earlier in the week, where we had the full moon and then we had the lunar eclipse, and the moon was kind of reddish and orangish. And I didn't wake up at 4 in the morning to see it this time. I saw pictures online. It's wild to me to look at the moon, especially on a really clear night where it's a full moon, and to see the light that comes from that and how many fewer stars you see as a result, and to think that moon puts off no light on its own. It's not like the stars and all the gases and all the, it's just this thing that is there that is on its own dark. But like us, who we are the light of the world, without this light of our own, we are reflecting another light. This light that comes from Jesus, the light from the sun, reflects to the moon enough so that we can walk outside on a dark night, but with a full moon, and we can see. We can know where we're going. We can walk along without any harm coming our way. Donald Barnhouse puts it this way, when Christ was in the world, he was like the shining sun. When the sun sets, the moon comes up. The moon is a picture of believers, the church. The church shines, but not with its own light. It shines with reflected light. And so the question we asked as we began our worship time this morning of how does the world see us, it's a question of how does the world see him? Because when the world sees people that are unkind and hateful and all of that, they don't see Jesus. They don't see the light reflecting in us. So the question for us is, are we walking as children of light? Are we walking in such a way that reflects him to the world around us, or are we instead just showing them more darkness that they have already? If we are to be imitators of his, that's where it begins for us. We look to the light and we reflect everything about it that we can. This morning, if you are not reflecting the light as a follower of his, you can begin to do that again. Maybe you have grown dim in what you do. You can instead shine for the world around you. Or if you have never begun to walk in the light, you can, as we've read about through Ephesians, you can put all that old behind you. You can let that old life die, and you can begin to live a life that imitates him and walks in the light. If there's some way we can help for the light to shine in your life, something we can do to bring it back, please come while we stand and sing.